According to reports, Israel and American officials are looking into proposals around a post-war Gaza Strip. Israel continues to carry out military operations in Gaza, leading to a massive loss of life for Palestinians. To discuss this, I'm now joined by Ayeesha Kadji, an international relations expert. Ayeesha, good afternoon. Appreciate your time. Can you give us an update on the current situation in Gaza and obviously those recent casualties?
Yes, there have been a large number of civilian casualties in Gaza as Israel continues its assault on Rafah, which is the last and southernmost urban center in Gaza, really. So there is nowhere for people to go from Gaza. They were assured from Rafah, they were assured as they were moved further and further south that they would be in a safe area. And this has proven untrue. Israel has continued to bombard large populated areas, including refugee camps, and the civilian casualties have soared into the, literally tens of thousands, and the injuries are now in the hundreds of thousands.
So let's go back to the International Court of Justice and certain rulings or advisories that they've given. What are those, and what should or how should Israel have reacted to these?
If Israel was serious about abiding by international humanitarian law, it would have complied with the International Court of Justice's advisories that it cease its military actions in Rafah, which it has failed to do. It has also not complied with the ICJ's ruling that it needs to allow immediate and unhindered humanitarian aid into Gaza. Many people in Gaza are now starving. Children have died from starvation. The elderly have died from starvation. There is no medical care in Gaza to speak of. And of course, there's very little food and very little water. And so Israel, by defying the International Court of Justice's rulings and generally being in defiance of international humanitarian law, is behaving with incredible impunity, and yet, the major powers in the world are standing by and allowing this to happen. It is currently now committing no less than genocide in Gaza.
And what has Israel's justification been to this continued onslaught?
Its justification, if it can be called justification, is that it wants to eradicate all Hamas members, so-called terrorists, and also secure the release of the remaining Israeli hostages. Yet every time Israel says this, it does so with an increased bombardment of civilians. It seems to not care how many civilian lives are lost in the process, because it's quite obvious that to Israel, Palestinian lives do not matter. If they did, they would have ceased from bombarding areas where civilians are known to be. They have caused, as I said, in the tens of thousands of deaths, at least half of which are women and children, more than half of which are women and children. And they have caused many, many, many injuries, including thousands of child amputees, many of whom are double or multiple amputees, the highest number of child amputees anywhere in the world in any conflict or war in history. That gives you some idea of how many children alone have been targeted by this war.
Ayeesha, you, I suppose, rhetorically asked the question, if Israel cared about Palestinians, then they would have stopped this onslaught. Does the rest of the world care about Palestinians? If I was to pose that question to you.
It appears that the rest of the world, in terms of civil society, does care. We've seen massive mobilization of civil society around the world. We've seen the student encampments. We've seen marches and protests. But when it comes to the governments, the leaders of the world, it truly appears that whether that is in the Middle East, whether that is in North America or in Western Europe, that the leaders do not care about Palestinian lives, that perhaps they've become inured to casualties and killings and injuries of brown people. We've seen that in other conflicts around the world. We've seen that in places like Sudan, where there is also currently, at the very least, an ethnic cleansing happening. We've seen very little mainstream media coverage of that. Similarly, in the DRC, we saw it with Syria, we saw it with Iraq, we saw it with Afghanistan. It just serves to reinforce the double standards, particularly of Western European and North American nations, when it comes to the United Nations, its institutions, including the World Court, the ICJ, and of course, decisions and advisories by the ICJ and by the UN Security Council. So these are applied selectively. If this were Ukraine and it were white lives, they would matter. Since this is Palestine, and of course, by extension, Sudan, DRC, etc., if these are not white lives, they seem to matter far, far less to people like Mr. Biden, Mr. Trump, Mr. Sunak, etc.
So what are the main proposals being discussed for the post-war governance of Gaza?
Well, post-war reconstruction of Gaza is going to be a very, very long-term effort. But it appears that Israel's agenda is to obliterate the bulk of the Gazan population. And there are several reasons for that. There is a proposed Ben Gurion Canal as an alternative to the Suez Canal, which would rake in millions of dollars for Israel over a relatively short period of time. There is also huge offshore gas fields off the coast of Gaza, which Israel wants to exploit. And the Western world wants Israel to exploit. That technically belongs to the Gazans, but of course they have not been allowed to exploit those gas fields because they've essentially been a concentration camp. They've been living in a large open-air concentration camp for almost 20 years.
So you're suggesting that the Western nations allowing, if they are, the continued bombardment of Gaza is largely economic?
Absolutely. Why else would the U.S. build its so-called aid pier and then actually use that pier to assist Israel to actually bombard, huge refugee camps with the supposed intention of taking out Hamas terrorists, but with the actual result of even more civilian casualties, hundreds to over 270 civilian casualties in that one mission alone. It points firstly to the hypocrisy of the U.S. in building that pier, but it also points to the fact that there is clearly an economic as well as a geopolitical imperative.
So what happens now? What does the world do? What can civil society do?
Well,
what can various citizens of the world, if you will, do to alleviate this continued suffering of the people in Gaza?
Continue to protest, continue to lobby our governments, our representatives in government, write letters, march, protest, demonstrate, sit in, etc., until some notice is taken of the situation once again. When it becomes uncomfortable for governments at the domestic level, when it becomes obvious that their citizens are watching and not approving of their actions, and especially in election years, then governments do actually submit to pressure. And we've seen that in the past, and we need to keep up the pressure on governments here in South Africa, but also around the world. The South African government has been the sole government, really, with the courage to take the Israeli case, the Palestinian case, to the International Court of Justice. And other administrations now have followed suit with regard not only to the ICJ, but also to the International Criminal Court, which holds individual leaders accountable as well. So we've seen some movement on the legal front, but we really need to keep up the civil society pressure, because that is really the only real avenue that citizens have to pressure their governments at the local and domestic levels, as well as the intergovernmental level.